Recording in
wherever you
progress.
are, as we focus on a cornerstone of high-quality research, the literature review. How to approach it critically, efficiently, and with impact, from framing research questions to translating evidence into meaningful conclusions. We're pleased to begin with our speakers, Mark Gill, now from Houston, Long from Vietnam, and then Daniel from Melbourne, who will share their perspectives and practical insights on conducting and presenting a robust literature search and review, drawing on their experience across clinical research and academia. Following the talks, we are honored to be joined by our panelists, John Hyatt and Fabrizio, for a panel discussion, and we look forward to a stimulating discussion, and thank you for being a part of this evening. Over to you, Mara.
Thank you, Leona. Thank you, Prof. So let me just quickly share my slides. So we will minimize it. Perfect. So the beginning of today is the literature search strategy, and basically this is how we will be flowing today. To answer any question we may have in our field in medicine, we will first have to conduct a search to see and to understand what has happened before us. So the first step will be the strategy per se, the literature search. Then we will take that question, that search, that architecture that we have built to the databases and repositories, and the final step would be the evaluation. And this is what we will be covering today. It will be me, Long, and then the final step when we do the critical appraisal and synthesis will be covered by Daniel. So in these 15 minutes, I will basically discuss how we define exactly what and how to extract the evidence we need from our databases, because the better our search is, the better and the higher quality the materials and the papers that we will review, and the worse it is, the more effort we will have to put in cleaning. And taking into account that there are about 14,000 papers published every day, that's likely to be an impossible mission otherwise. So in every search strategy, basically there are 5 steps. First, it's to define our question. And we may know what we want to know, but we need to be very specific. What is it exactly? What is the scope of my question? What am I really asking? And what is the framework? So what is the population? What is the conditions that I'm exactly looking at? Then I always say that this is a teamwork. We need to sit down together and we need to come up and brainstorm in the specific vocabularies, words that may be using and may be related to our topic, because we may say, hey, pregnancy, but no, beware that gestation may also be a word. Once we have identified all those words, which is the hardest step, we need to build them together and logically. So we need to combine this word and this, or this plus this. So we need to combine so that we can take that huge sentence that comes from the search and put it in the databases. And that's what we could execute and expand. And although this is long stock, this is something that, is presented linearly. But if the search is good, it actually needs to be iterative. So you have conducted the first initial search, you review your outcome, and then you construct again, because you need to identify missing papers that you think they should be there, and you also need to remove things, and you need to redefine. Once everything is done, we need to document very clearly what we have done. So that's a continuous process, because the search must be reproducible. So we always need to give something that taken to somewhere else would be, and I always remember Professor Nicolaides saying, when we were publishing the first searches in cell-free DNA, he was saying, somebody needs to come and say, on the 1st of July, I conducted this search, and that gave me these papers. So that needs to happen. So we'll basically be covering these first 3 steps. But as I said, this is an interactive thing. And now, easy, let's work through a question. So the first step, we need to formulate and deconstruct the question. So when the aspirin trial was thought, the research idea that was behind that was, does aspirin prophylaxis prevent preterm preeclampsia, right? But if we think through it, does it prevent preterm preeclampsia? Obviously, but where, to whom? Well, we would say it has to be women and pregnancy, but yeah. Preeclampsia. But we would also need to be clear on how to define that, yes? So these four elements are key, that we are very clear, especially when we are doing a meta-analysis. We need to define them very well, as we will see later on in Daniel's talk. So, and I have to say that I've learned over the years, and Leona, you will remember, when we were doing the meta-analysis in early aspirin, like before 11 weeks, that if we were included preeclampsia as an outcome, we were missing many key papers. And the reason for that is that the search, the specific terms will only be looked at the title and abstract. And those may not have been reflected there. So, for example, they may have said adverse pregnancy outcome or hypertensive disorders in pregnancy, and we forgot that. So it's very common that in the initial search, we don't include the outcome. So we exclude the outcome. We say just pregnancy and aspirin and see how it comes. And then we build on that. So when we are thinking of terms, we need to speak two languages. So everybody is always welcome. We researchers are prone to use natural language. Like we will say specific words that we want to say. In my cell-free DNA test, it was cell-free DNA, non-invasive testing, none with a dash, none without altogether one word. So all those three words that will go in quotation mark must match exactly what the title and the abstract says. If there is one character that is different, it won't retrieve that paper. So let's say preeclampsia with and without a dash. If we write preeclampsia, it won't retrieve any of the papers that have a dash in between. So it's always nice if you're not a librarian, if you have a specific training, to use controlled vocabulary. Those are the subject headings, the index terms that when the paper goes to the database is assigned by the humans, by the indexers. So we call them MESH in PubMed or M3 in Embase. So the benefit of using, in addition to our text words, controlled vocabulary is that many of those synonyms that we may not know may have been captured by the indexers when including the article in the database. So natural language will capture exact abstract and title matches, nothing else. And controlled vocabulary will include and capture the concept. So whenever preeclampsia concept has been identified by the indexer. And that doesn't matter how it was written in the paper. Now, how can we improve if we are saying the word needs to be exact? How can I make it a little bit more flexible? And for that, we have several mechanisms. So as I was saying, if I say higher education, we will be missing higher priority and education, for example. But then we can use, for example, STAR, and that's very common. So we say pediatric STAR, and we will have pediatrics, pediatrician. That basically that STAR means that you can expand the word afterwards. So you need to match specifically those letters, but after that you can continue with whatever comes later. And then we have wildcards. This is the brief summary. So for example, if we say write an interrogation mark there, very common to do in gynecology, we will be covering whatever is in between those two letters. So it can be pediatric, but it can also be pediatric. So it's useful to capture spelling, especially between American and British English differences. Now, we've identified our terms. We are happy with them. We need to put them together. So how do we connect those concepts? And let's say we have realized that the papers will talk about hypertension, disorders in pregnancy, but let's make it simple, hypertension and preeclampsia. So we say hypertension and preeclampsia. Well, if we do that, and you see this diagram, actually what we will be telling the database is that we want the papers that contain both words, like all the two words needs to be present, and that narrows a lot the results. We are stuck to this little common chunk of papers. We will have to write, and Long will also be commenting on this, is or we want to say the paper has the word hypertension or preeclampsia, and that will broaden the results, but we'll make sure that both concepts, either or, are present in the paper, and it's very, very essential to do that when we are using synonyms. Many times we say or we think, but not the ones that speak about that. Okay, be careful with this. And I don't want to forget that. Because when we say not, I don't think I have ever used not. Because many papers use the word like they just pass through it. Like they say something like they don't, whatever, had chronic or they didn't have a history of cancer. And just because they say no, or because they mention it for any reason, that paper automatically is excluded. So every paper that contains that word in the abstract or title will be removed from the search. So be very careful. And then we start doing our search, and we need to balance between sensitivity and specificity, precision, how accurate. And so what do we choose? That basically depends on what are you trying to do. Because when we are trying to do a systematic review, meta-analysis, we need to find absolutely everything. So we need to apply very little and very few filters. We want all the papers. We don't want to miss anything. So we will have to accept a lot of noise. So as I reflected here, we will need to get many, many citations that are useless for our purpose just to identify them all. So we need to apply very little filters. We need to screen a lot. So this will require a lot of manpower afterwards to cleaning. But on the other hand, if I'm in the clinic and I have a question or I'm going to present tomorrow a specific case that I have questions and I want to review the literature quickly, then I can apply more filters, I can be more specific, and I will get probably 3 randomized control trials, as I say, pregnancy or preeclampsia, and randomized control trials. So we filter like very much, and we will get very few papers, but it's likely that all of them, they won't be all, but all of them will be relevant in it to my purpose. So how to synthesize then this query, and then is when I build what I call the block strategy. So then is when the peak of things come in. So you have all the synonyms and all the ways you have to refer to your population, like hypertension, high blood pressure, preeclampsia, and we will include the intervention and all the words we have identified for our intervention. And then we get the outcome that is a highly sensitive and precise search string that we can actually copy and paste with very little modifications from PubMed to Embase. Now, and this is the interesting part for me, beyond the keywords, we have our traditional screening, we have created our search, whatever it is in the pink box, and that search relies exactly on what we have written, and it will retrieve what we have written, nothing else, nothing more. It's very rigorous, but it's very time intensive. Now we have artificial intelligence, and I became a huge fan of these things because now we can, as a first step, we can do augmented searching by artificial intelligence. So we have our search, we have our terms, we have our papers, and now we have artificial intelligence tools that will be on the one side, some of them will analyze the concept and will look for more through the concept, and some others that will look at the references, and we will be bringing you papers that are related to those references. For example, this is called citation chasing. You have identified 4 or 5 papers, one paper that you know that is the key paper, and it will look at your references before and your references forward, the papers that the paper has cited and the papers that have cited that paper afterwards. So you give 1 or 2 papers, and it gives you an output of all the things that have been published before and after, like type of thing. So nowadays, when I have a question, the first thing is I do my PICO concepts. I take them to specific AI places that will help me map before and after. And once I have identified like more things, then I continue to construct my search and take it to the databases. So to summarize, and like a few golden rules, apply artificial intelligence. So we have to build a strategy like always, and then we can apply to artificial intelligence. But if we only rely on artificial intelligence to build up, we will fail because it will give us a poor strategy. It can only help us like navigate things that we may have missed, but help. We need to mix, we need to combine words, we need to run the search, we need to go back, and we need to do that several times. And then at the very end, we always need to verify every source we get. When we use artificial intelligence, we need to acknowledge that. We need to say in which steps we have used artificial intelligence nowadays. We must not escape that. And nowadays we have this Prisma Trace checklist that will help us say, okay, I use artificial intelligence in step 1, step 2, step 3. And that's a full disclosure. Some of my slides, I use Notebook LM to help. So thank you very much, and long to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mar. So let me just share my screen. So, good day, everyone. This is Long from Vietnam, and it is my great honor to join this webinar series. And following Dr. Ma's excellent overview of the literature retrieval plans, I will share a topic on how to use common database effectively. So when we search for reviews in the literature, sometimes we get confused about several types of reviews. Therefore, understanding the scope and objective of each review is very important for our interpretations. So far, we have 14 types of reviews, and maybe the most common types are literature review and systematic review and meta-analysis. So I will briefly compare the literature review and systematic review as an example because it's related to how we use the database later on. The first literature review is aimed to summarize what is known about the topic or summarize the current knowledge. So literature reviews are best when you want an overview to spot the gaps or to understand the background. And they are flexible in how they are done and may not use comprehensive search or formal quality assessment. In contrast, systematic reviews is best for reproducible, evidence-based answer to a specific clinical or policy questions using predefined steps. So of course, we need to have very comprehensive search and critical quality assessment for the papers. And also we need to consider the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the papers that we want to involve to include in the search. So these slides have a list of different databases that we can use for literature review and retrieval. So electronic database, which are the organized, searchable or collections of journals and abstract. And usually we use MedLive, Embase, Cochrane Library Database, Web of Science, Google Scholar, and National Database. But sometimes, for example, like in the systematic review, we need to go for gray literature as well. So in that case, we need to go to another databases for gray literature, for the conference papers, for dissertation, etc. And sometimes we need to know what is happening right now, so then we can go to like clinical trial registry So database like clinicaltrials.gov or the International Controlled Trials Registry allow us to see what study are currently recruiting and have finished but haven't published yet. So this is a summary of the most common database that we use in academic and clinical research. So PubMed is a primary tool for the medical and clinical research and is free to use. It includes Medline and many other journals in the life and health science. Embase is very strong for Medline coverage and drug-related studies, but it requires a subscription and you need to access through your institution's library. And Scopus and Web of Science are multidisciplinary platforms that cover large number of citation, books, and patents, but both requires subscription access. Google Scholar is very convenient for searching and of course it's free. It covers a limited number of journals, citation, book, and particularly great literature. So many people talking about PubMed, but Medline, because this is the most common database that we use in the daily practice. So PubMed is stand for Public Medicines, run by the National Center for Biotechnology Information, and is comprised three main components. The first is Medline. Medline is world's largest medical library that include all of journals that meet National Library of Medicine selection criteria from the US. The second part is PubMed Centrals, include all of the free full text articles that funded by the National Institute of Health. And the last thing is a bookshelf, a collection of the online books and reports in the life science and healthcare. So sometimes people confuse about Medline and PubMed because sometimes they come together. So Medline is like an intersection between PubMed and Embase. So PubMed is more US medicine oriented with a focus on the health science, where Embase is more European medicine and focus more on pharmacology. So I think Dr. Ma already mentioned about MASH, but I take PubMed as an example because this is the most common database that we use every day. Because it's covered the majority of the biomedical literature and importantly is freely accessible. So one of the fundamental part that makes PubMed powerful and precise is a MASH or medical subject headings. It's like M3 in the Embase. So MASH is a National Library of Medicine's control vocabulary. It's a carefully organized thesaurus for over more than 30,000 standardized medical terms used to index the medical literature in Medline and PubMed. So why is this important? Look at the image in the middle. So we suppose that authors write a paper and use the term prematurity, but the reader search using the keyword preterm birth. So if you search only for ordinary keywords, these two people might miss each other. So the solution is PubMed use MASH as a bridge, and both those terms are labeled under the common headings we call premature birth. So that's way, whichever term you use, the system will lead you to a very relevant articles. So I have an example next to that. You can see when I type premature birth, this is exactly MASH term already. But when I change to preterm birth, PubMed also capture premature birth in the search. And also if I change to prematurity, it's also searched with premature birth. So the next is how PubMed works behind the scenes or similar to M3, or we call the function automatic term mappings, ATM. So when you type the search phrase into PubMed search box, PubMed attempts to match your input to several index fields in a specific orders. So first of all, is try to map your input to a MASH term. And if it cannot find any relevant MASH term, it's moved to map to your journal title. And then if we cannot find any relevant journal title, it's moved to author's name. And then next is we'll break multiple words phrase into individual terms and search in all fields. Finally is we'll use the combined terms with and and search in all fields. And during the search, is also consider British and American spellings, singular and plural words, and synonyms. So I have two examples. When I use prematurity, so it's matched to premature birth. So this is the match term. So it will not move to journal's title or author's name. And then it's break preterm premature birth into premature and birth, and then premature birth as a whole. And it's also considered singular and plural words, like you can see prematurity and prematurities. And for another example, fetal growth restriction, you can see the first word is a fetal growth restriction with O in the fetal, which is a British spelling. And the next is a fetal growth retardation. This is a mass term of fetal growth restriction. And you can see it's break down the words and combine the words at the end. So this is how PubMed and Embase works. So this is the technique of PubMed. I think Dr. Ma already mentioned. I just have example for preeclampsia and prediction, for example. When I use the AND, you can see that the result will come back like 6,800 papers that have mentioned prediction and preeclampsia. But when I use OR, the PubMed will turn out to be like any article mention either preeclampsia or predictions. And I agree with Dr. Ma that usually we use all for the synonym or like related concepts. And in this example, you can see that because prediction is very a broad term in medicine, so that's why the result jumped to 2.3 millions. And sometimes we want to reduce the noise from the search, and with the caution by Dr. Ma, and we can see that if we use not preeclampsia, not prediction. So it's come back to all of the result with preeclampsia, for example, like treatment for preeclampsia, pathophysiology of preeclampsia, but not related to prediction. And sometime now we know and we understand the operators, but how to use it when we have two or more operators together. So we call a technique named nesting. So without parentheses, PubMed will read your search from the left to the right. So which can lead to a completely irrelevant result. For example, in the left, I use the search preeclampsia and prediction or screening. So PubMed will first find everything for preeclampsia and predictions, and then ask every single paper within the database that mentions screening, regardless whether it has anything to do with preeclampsia. So you see in the result, we have some strange findings like cancer screening or cervical cancer screening. But if we use parentheses in prediction and screening, so PubMed will come back with papers that mention preeclampsia, and they must also mention either prediction and screening. So we can focus on more papers related to screening and prevention for preeclampsia. And sometimes we need to use double quotes and truncation, as Dr. Ma already mentioned. So if we need to find, to search for exact phrase, we can use double quotes. For example, in this example, I use double quote in preeclampsia prediction. So my search narrowed down to 100 papers that have exact phrase that I search. And sometimes we use like asterisk symbol to capture the variation of the language. So if I use predict plus asterisk symbol, the result come back with all of the words like prediction, predicting, predictive, predictors, etc. So we have captured more than 1,000 more papers than the baseline. And if we want to like limit our search to a very recent papers, so we can narrow down the time of publication, or you choose the very specific time of publication if you want. And if you want to focus on a very specific like study design, like randomized control trial or like observational cohort, etc., you can click on the filter, and then it will come back all of the results related to that study design. And if you want to go like, you want to control everything in the search, you can go for advanced search. So for example, I type preeclampsia, and I just want to focus on the papers that have preeclampsia in the title. So I use drop down list here, and I choose title next to my keywords. and then I can use Boolean operators. This is all my talk. Thank you very much for your attention. And next, Dr. Daniel Rolnick will talk about critical appraisal for academic papers. So, Daniel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Long, and thanks Leona and John and Kipros for the invitation. So I was asked to talk about critical appraisal. You just saw from Long and Mar how to find the papers that you want to find. And now I'll tell you what to do with them and how to critically assess their quality and their results. So what I want to cover in the next 15 to 20 minutes, we will first talk about some integrity issues, and this seems to be a much bigger problem than we thought before. So we'll talk about red flags for identifying problematic studies. Then we'll talk about the study design hierarchy, which is very famous, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the strengths and limitations of different study designs. We talk about the power of randomization and this concept of exchangeability. I'll try to explain what that is. We'll talk about confounding in observational studies and how we can address that. And then finally, I'll try to give you a few tools and a few real-world examples in the field of maternal fetal medicine of how we can analyze papers. So let's get started, and let's first talk about integrity, because if integrity is compromised, then you can actually forget about everything else. If the study is not trustworthy, you can probably stop there and you don't even need to read the rest of the paper. As I said, this is a much bigger problem than we thought in the past. There is a lot of work being done in this space, but I just wanted to show you here the number of retractions every year, and this has been increasing exponentially. In 2023, we had more than 10,000 retractions in the medical literature. This is a quote from Professor Ben Moe, who has been doing a lot of work on the integrity space. And he says that at least 25% of the clinical trials informing clinical guidelines may not be trustworthy. So we estimate that a large proportion of these trials have actually never happened, never taken place. And this definitely impacts patient care. So this leads to flawed randomized trials being incorporated into, therefore, flawed meta-analysis. These meta-analyses often inform guidelines, and these will potentially lead to patient harm. So we have a whole range of examples of interventions that have been adopted based on this flawed data and that later were shown to be ineffective or harmful even in more improper randomized trials that followed. So integrity is the first step. People have come up with this type of checklists. This is one of the most commonly used checklists for assessing integrity of randomized trials. It's called track checklist. You can see here, I won't go into details, but you can see here that there are 7 domains that you can assess. And for each item of these domains, you will rate the paper as having concerns or not having concerns or having potentially some concerns. And then you can assess whether this is a trustworthy or an untrustworthy paper. But a lot of these guidelines rely on some of these red flags that I'll talk about. I'm listing here 10 red flags that should raise your suspicion if you see things like that in a study. One is, for example, in randomized trials, we know that since 2010, trial registration is mandatory. And if you see a trial published after 2010 without registration, this is suspicious. You see a very large multi-center trial, 20,000 patients published in a renowned journal out there, and it has only 2 authors. That is very suspicious. Mark spoke about the ASPRE trial. We did the ASPRE trial, hundreds of people working in the trial, major effort, major funding going into it. So if you see a very large trial with 2 or 3 authors alone, be suspicious. Implausibly fast recruitment. So thousands of patients being recruited in 6 months, very unlikely. 0 loss to follow-up. So you recruit 1,000 patients in each group and no loss to follow-up. That's very suspicious. Baseline characteristics tables that are highly matched or very, very similar, almost too good to be true. primary outcomes that were not defined in advance or that were changed after protocol registration, effect size much larger than what we would expect in trials or in other trials trying to answer the same question. Things like multiple retractions by some of these authors in previous studies will make you suspicious, identical numbers across variables, and again, more than 3, 4, 5 trials published by the same first author in the same year, which is extremely hard to do. It's very hard to do one trial, let alone 3, 4 trials in the same year. And this is not only a problem in obstetrics, this has been widely studied in other areas. John Carlisle, who also does a lot of work on this in anesthesia, has reported that about 44% of the trials submitted to the journal Anesthesia were based on false data. This is another giant from the field, so Professor Ioannidis from Stanford, who has looked at a lot of integrity concerns, and he states that there are hundreds of thousands of zombie trials circulating among us. And I just wanted to give you some examples from our field. This is one of the trials on induction of labor, where we actually got a hold of the data set. And when you look here at the BMI column and many other columns in this data set, you can see that the BMI was created using a random number generator in Excel. So that is very problematic, and this is definitely a trial that never happened. Another 2 studies published in completely different journals in different years with slightly different titles. When you look at their baseline characteristics, you see that the numbers are almost identical or only changed by 1 or 2 decimal points. So this is highly suspicious. If we are lucky, one of these trials was real, and the other one is completely fake. And this is probably one of the champions. This is not from the obstetric field, but these people used ChatGPT to write the paper and didn't even read what ChatGPT gave them. And you can see here they forgot to remove this warning from ChatGPT about the paper being written by a large language model. So be very careful with this type of things. This crisis has even been highlighted by the non-medical literature. You can see here one of the articles that was published last year in The Economist. And I just wanted to show you that almost 1,000 randomized trials have been flagged as suspicious in obstetrics and gynecology. A lot of them have been retracted, but very often these investigations and retractions take a very long time. Now, let's assume that integrity is not a problem, that the trial you're looking at or the study you're looking at is a trustworthy study. Then you know all very well this hierarchy, this pyramid of quality of evidence, where systematic reviews and meta-analysis, which are basically evidence synthesis, sit at the top. Then the second layer is randomized controlled trials, which are intervention and therefore always prospective studies. And then you have the observational studies that come at the bottom. So cohort studies, just to remind you, cohort studies are studies where you compare 2 groups based on exposure and follow them up prospectively or retrospectively to see if they develop the outcome. And these studies are also plagued by confounding. There is a risk of selection bias, and they are generally deemed as hypothesis generating at best. So observational studies always have the risk of confounding. Case control studies are similar, but you start from the outcome. So you take a group of patients who had preeclampsia, a group of patients who did not have preeclampsia, and you go back to see if they had, if they smoked, or if they had chronic hypertension, or if they had diabetes. So you start from the outcome and go back to exposure. And this also has the potential of confounding, recall bias, and selection bias. Case reports and case series are almost anecdotal evidence, and expert opinions is the lowest level of evidence because it's essentially opinion, is not really evidence. And we know that the ones sitting at the top are deemed to be the highest quality studies. But the problem is that study design alone does not guarantee quality. A randomized trial can be a very poorly conducted randomized trial and not give you the answers you need. So sometimes a very well-conducted cohort study may be more useful and trustworthy than a flawed meta-analysis or a problematic randomized control trial. And then we have the other problem, which is this epidemic of meta-analysis. So if you go to PubMed and just type there meta-analysis, you will see this exponential, this explosion of publication of meta-analysis, and it's very easy to understand why. It's much easier to do a meta-analysis than to do a properly conducted randomized control trial. So there is an excessive number of meta-analyses. Sometimes we have 2 or 3 meta-analyses published trying to answer the same question in the same year and arriving at different conclusions. And yes, if they are well conducted, they can be very helpful. But I would say that more than 80% of the meta-analyses are, like Professor Nicolaides says, spaghetti a carbonara cooked by an Indian cook in a Chinese takeaway. Okay, let's talk about the power of randomization. So what you do in a randomized trial is you have a very clearly defined target population, very clear inclusion criteria, eligibility criteria. You then prospectively consent these patients, enroll them in the trial, and randomize them to receive the treatment of interest or placebo. And then you follow them up, or control, or placebo, or no treatment, and you follow them up and compare the outcomes between the groups. Now, the key features of an ideal, quote unquote, randomized trial are randomization, which will get rid of treatment allocation and selection bias issues, allocation concealment and blinding, which will again get rid of selection bias, will get rid of problems with outcome ascertainment bias because you know to which group patients have been allocated, and will be analyzed as intention to treat to preserve the benefits of randomization. And what randomized trials do very, very nicely is bring in this concept of exchangeability. It sounds very complicated, but it's the simple fact that the groups only differ by the treatment that they received. Everything else, the groups are comparable. And if the treated group had not been treated, you would expect them to have the exact same outcomes as the untreated group and vice versa. So the groups are completely exchangeable. And they would have the opposite outcomes if they had the opposite treatment allocations. This can actually be very well demonstrated mathematically using the so-called counterfactual theory. But the beauty of randomized trials is that they control for both measured and unmeasured confounders. So you don't need to adjust for the confounders that you measured, and it also gets rid of confounders that you don't know about and that have not been measured. An example has been mentioned here multiple times, ASPRE trial, we are all very familiar with. As I said, a major effort, hundreds of people working on it, very large number of women screened and then allocated, high-risk women allocated to receive aspirin or placebo. And we found this 62% reduction in the aspirin group compared to the placebo in terms of preterm preeclampsia. But the important message here is that the effect we see in this kind of large, well-conducted trials can be assumed to be the causal effect of aspirin on preeclampsia, the unbiased, unconfounded effect of aspirin on the outcome of interest. Now, when you do this in an observational study, in a cohort study, for example, there is always the problem of confounders. So treatment is not allocated randomly, and we use this kind of graph depiction. So this is called directed acyclic graph, where you can see very clearly that you have confounders that influence both the treatment and the outcome. And therefore, any association that you see between the treatment and the outcome may be a spurious association driven by this confounder rather than by the exposure itself. And just to bring it back to the preeclampsia example, if you do a cohort study on aspirin to prevent preeclampsia, a lot of the times, because treatment is not given randomly, women who received aspirin for a reason. And usually they are much higher risk than those who did not receive aspirin. The groups are not really comparable. And what happens very often, if you look into studies, observational studies, looking at the effect of aspirin for preeclampsia, it seems that aspirin is actually harmful. The rates of preeclampsia are higher in the aspirin group than in the group that did not receive aspirin. But this is the effect of a third variable or multiple other variables that actually define who takes aspirin and also define your risk of preeclampsia. So just to summarize this part of the talk, randomization ensures exchangeability. High-risk women are equally allocated to both groups. You have double-blinded treatment, and then it measures the true, unbiased, unconfounded causal effect. And when you do that in an observational study, you often get this paradox where it seems that the treatment is harmful because there is confounding. And even if you try to adjust for those confounders, often there is unmeasured confounding that you cannot adjust for. This is another study that I was just talking to Professor Nicolaides just before this webinar. The next question is the study design really adequate to answer the question at hand? I just wanted to bring as an example a recent study comparing pre and post implementation of preeclampsia screening and showed similar rates of preterm preeclampsia before and after implementation of screening. And if you only read the conclusion of the abstract of the paper, you will come to the conclusion that the strategy doesn't actually work. But then you look at table 1 and you see that there are many, many differences in age, BMI, smoking, diabetes, and so on and so forth between the population before screening and after screening. So the population has become more and more high risk over time. The second period of the study is clearly at higher risk of developing preeclampsia and is really comparing just the overall rates before and after appropriate. If you did actually a time series, you could have seen something like that. And if you look here, you have increasing rates of preeclampsia before the intervention. And this is just a fictitious example. It's not necessarily what happened in this study. And then after you implement screening, you start having a decrease in the rates of preeclampsia. But actually, both the overall rates in both periods here in this graph are 0.9%. So if you just compare the rates, it's very misleading, but actually the graph tells you a very different story. And to finish off, you always need to ask yourself 3 questions. Is it a valid study? So is that study good in terms of internal validity? Is the study design appropriate? Was the risk of bias minimized? Was confounding addressed if this is an observational study? And are there integrity concerns? Now, supposing, assuming that those criteria are all met and this study is a valid study, then what are the results? Are the results meaningful, not only statistically significant, but clinically meaningful? Is there a large or a small effect size? Are the confidence intervals and the uncertainty reported around these estimates? And lastly, can I apply it to my population? Is it externally valid? Are my population and this study population similar? Is the intervention actually feasible? Are the outcomes relevant to my population? Are the benefits of the intervention outweighing the harms? So a few extra questions to always ask yourselves when you're reading a study. Is the research question clearly defined? And is it clinically meaningful? Do we really need to know if music therapy has an impact on the rates of success of IVF? Or is this a waste of time and resources? Is the study design appropriate to answer the question at hand? Remember, observational studies are not really suited to investigate treatment effects. They can investigate implementation, they can investigate disease prevalence, they can investigate many other things, but they're not really good to investigate the effects of treatments. Is there a clear predefined primary outcome? And outcomes should be defined a priori and ideally registered in protocol and published before the study is conducted. And is there evidence of selective reporting? Are there many, many small p-values reported in the paper? Is there evidence that the authors actually try to chase statistical significance to then report in the paper? Because it's always easier to publish a paper that is highly positive than a paper that has negative findings. But I would argue that a paper with negative findings is just as important as the one with positive findings. And these are just some common pitfalls. First of all, assuming that all RCTs are valid. As I said before, RCTs are very good level of evidence when well conducted, but it can also be poorly designed, they can be biased, they can be fabricated, and always appraise them critically. People often ignore confounding by indication, like we explained in the aspirin example in an observational study. Overinterpreting subgroup analysis. Subgroup analyses are always underpowered from a statistical point of view. The more comparisons you make in your paper, the more likely you are to find false positive small p-values, because if you do 100 analyses statistically and we would expect 5% of them to be positive by chance. So these also should be pre-specified. There is a very common mistake, which is conflating statistical significance with clinical significance. So a p-value below 0.05 does not necessarily mean that the effect is clinically important. You may have a 1% reduction in a specific outcome that in a very large study will be clinically significant, but it's not really important from a clinical point of view. And equally, a high p-value does not necessarily mean that there is no association. There is a very common saying in epidemiology that says that the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. So sometimes you just don't have enough power to show a significant and important effect. And be aware of the selection bias in meta-analysis. The incorporation of studies that are problematic or that are fraudulent will distort the results of your meta-analysis. So to finish off, read the entire paper. I would say that 90% of the people read the conclusion of the abstract and assume that that is the ground truth. Don't do that. Read the whole paper. Two, assess for integrity issues. 3, proper randomization achieves exchangeability and enables causal inference, and importantly, controls for both measured and unmeasured confounding. But again, randomized trials can also be poorly conducted. Observational studies are always susceptible to confounding. Always take them with a pinch of salt, and they are at best hypothesis generating. Go back to the drawing board. If you are planning to do a study or planning to do a randomized trial, go back to the drawing board and draw your assumptions, draw your expected associations, and then you will know what you need to adjust for. And always ask this question: is it valid? What are the results? Can I apply it to my patients? Thank you very much. I think that's all I had, and thanks again for the invitation. Very happy to take questions.
Fantastic talks from all three speakers. And I hope you don't mind that we've gone a little bit over time, but then really informative talks. I learned so much today about the question mark in pediatric as a way of doing a search, and to long, obviously, I'm afraid I'm no longer in a position to do proper searches, and I'm always relying on you and showing all the databases and examples is very important. And Daniel, for obviously covering a very fast topic in a very short space of time. So I will hand over to Fabrizio and John.
Thanks to all three speakers, because I think you've all taught me something this evening. Little tips and tricks from Ma, Long. I really enjoyed listening to your description of how the different databases work. That was really useful. And Daniel, I thought that was a really good run through about the process of analysis, and I particularly like the comments on power and sample size and thinking about that in terms of interpretation. I think for anybody who's sort of starting out in their research career, one of the interesting things that I find, certainly for me, is if I sort of dream up a new idea and go and look at the literature, I often find it's not a completely new idea, and that someone's been there before and has had some thoughts about it as a topic. So I think it's been really interesting just to hear, Mar, about how you go about taking your hypothesis, if you like, and starting to develop a research strategy with that. Do you want to say a little bit about how much time you think that someone should commit to trying to develop their literature search? Is this something you can plan to do in an hour, or is it going to take you a day or a couple of weeks?
Thank you. Very good point. And actually, I believe like when we say that just do this search and you just put this and that in PubMed, that's absolutely misleading. And I have to say that conducting a proper search strategy, is closer to the 2 weeks type of thing than the 2 hours search, because when you start doing your searches, I actually don't start by writing the 2 papers in PubMed. I usually start by taking a couple of papers I know I want to include, and I look at the keywords that they have. I look at the references. I never start by searching in PubMed. I always start by opening the paper and doing exactly what Daniel said. Read it from the beginning to the end, including the references. And it's from the 2, 3, 4, 5 gold standard, I call them, that I start constructing the search. So it's not the other way around, and it's a long process.
Yeah, okay. And I think one of those perhaps take-home messages is looking at other sets of keywords on the front of a paper. I guess another place that you can find things like mesh headings that I think Long was talking about is if you do go to a systematic review that's already been done on a topic, that perhaps helps you at least as a starter for where you could go with that. Long, have you got any other comments about this process and how long it takes and what you think you learn, if you like, during the iterations of a search that you do?
So actually, I have one experience working with Ma for systematic review. I think it's take quite long process to identify the search and also to identify the right database as well, because like for the systematic review, we not only go for electronic databases, we also need to look for the gray literature as well, because many evidence in the literature saying that if we add more evidence from the gray literature, we can maybe the conclusion may change or the result may change from the papers that we only consider within like the common electronic databases. So after the developing the search, so we need to have a proper step to identify the databases, and it takes quite long. So because we have a lot of resources for great literature. For example, sometimes we need to go back to the FMF website to search for like the abstract from the previous Congress. So,
yeah. Okay. Thank
you.
Fabricio, some comments?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, John. Thank you, Leona, Kypros, you, John, for the invitation. Congratulations for the presentation of the speakers. Like you, John, I also learned quite a lot today, and it's quite amazing to see the number of people connected and keen to learn about research. We have some questions from the audience, but before I'm going to the questions, I want to ask a question for Mar. We are in the era of AI. This is undeniable, right? What do you think about the use of AI to help you with Pico, to help you with mesh words? Do you have some experience and tips for the audience?
Yes, and that has made our life much easier. That is true. So I am not going to say that I use it for the Pico, and I am not aware that there is a software that helps you build the Pico, because I think that comes naturally. I feel happy, but not with that. But once I have my research question in place and I have 1 or 2 papers that I know I want to include, now I am taking them into specific databases that help me a lot. So, we can give then to the, like, we can provide like resources to the attendants, to the audience, but you have now like lead maps. So you take the paper and you upload there, and it will give you like the chronological sequence. So I did that exercise. I uploaded the Aspre trial, and it was giving me everything that was published, like chronologically, to get to the Aspre trial, and everything that has been cited in the Aspre trial ever since. And you got in 2 minutes an idea of what has happened in the field. So that helps you a lot. And I would say nowadays, for at least for my clinical practice, not for publishing a meta-analysis or systematic review, I only use AI carefully, and you need to look at the results and everything, but I only take the paper, put it in there. And now you have even places that will give you the synthesis. So you have elicit and elicit. You upload your like gold standard papers, like you have 6-7 papers, you upload them there, and it gives you like a summary table, like we used to do for the meta-analysis. You need to recheck, but to have a first idea and to come up with an answer to your colleagues when you are looking for something is 5 minutes process.
Yeah, but as you said, so important to recheck, right? You have to have your base knowledge, because we still have a lot of hallucinations, especially if you're using, depending of the AI, in terms of references that they seem quite real, but they can be false. And even
completely generated.
Yes, it's becoming critical for reviewers and editors to identify it, right? If I can go
So
for...
I think if I can comment on that, Fabrizio,
Yeah.
I think everybody is now using AI. Even, I mean, I do it all the time, even to correct my English. When I write in a paper, I will not write anything nowadays that I have not copied, pasted somewhere and said review. So at least I think what we should be doing, and I don't see that very often, is acknowledging the use of AI. And that's okay, as far as we are transparent and we say, okay, we use AI for this purpose. And that's okay.
Yeah, I completely agree. If I can go for some questions from the audience, I think this one is for you, Daniel. It's from Denise Lapa from Brazil. She's asking, suppose you find a critical flaw in a paper, how to ask for retraction? Is there a proper channel to do it?
Thanks, Fabrizio, and thanks, Denise. Good to see you here. And so the simple answer is no, there is no simple streamlined process to do that. Bear in mind that this is a relatively new area and people feel very uncomfortable talking about it. So we need to acknowledge that. The usual channels are, at least from some of my colleagues who have been doing a lot of work on this, usually first reach out to the authors and ask them about the problem you found. The next step is to reach out to journal editors and ask for an investigation or for the raw data and this kind of thing. So this is how things have been happening. Obviously, this is often a difficult thing to do. And I worry for some of my colleagues that they will be stabbed in the streets. But yeah, this is how it is happening. There is a lot more people now talking about it. We need to acknowledge that Cochrane has recently run a full weekend congress on integrity alone, and this was all started by John Ioannidis and John Carlisle and Ben Moll. So this is changing, the tide is changing, but it takes time. And a lot of those investigations also take time. Some journals are, and some editors are more proactive than others. The editors of many ONG journals came up with a joint statement some time ago about integrity as well. So we are seeing some changes, but it takes time.
Yeah, I think that's very, very topical, isn't it? And even in our area, this was mentioned before, some systematic review and meta-analysis that changed clinical practice. I think that calcium is one example. Progesterone is another one that you are using clinical practice, but came from flawed papers. Yeah, this is definitely it's a big concern.
Yeah,
John?
and many, 20, 30% of the papers included in these Cochrane reviews are very problematic. Same thing with calcium, as you mentioned. Same thing with omega-3 for prevention of preterm birth. A lot of these trials are not well-conducted trials, and a lot of them relying on subgroup analysis, but having a negative analysis for the primary outcome. So they have a negative result for the primary outcome, and then they do multiple subgroup analysis, of which one is positive, and then they come up with the conclusion that it works.
Okay.
John or Kypros, if you want to comment something.
We've got a couple of other questions just about process of study design and whether you know a randomized controlled trial is poorly designed, and how do you identify that? I think in terms of both looking at your own study design and also trying to look at the design of other studies, one of the most useful things you can do is to actually look at this as a group of peers. So things like journal club and presenting a topic and including sort of members of your department that vary in seniority, I think is a good way of, as a group, developing experience about how you think a trial is constructed and doing, if you like, team analysis of that. Ma, Long, I don't know whether you wanted to comment further on that. Ma, you might have something to say about AI in terms of its critique of a published randomized controlled trial.
I have no idea of how to use AI for a randomized controlled trial, but what you said, I think, is very important. There was a question also saying how to develop your study, how to create it. And I think it's about what you just said, is ask seniors. Like when you start, you believe you can do everything. And then I think you encounter many things that you didn't contemplate. So if you are lucky and you have a mentor, you have people that have gone through the process before, just brainstorm. Comment with them what you want to do, what you have in mind, how you have designed things, and let them criticize you and take experience. I think when in clinical research, especially, research is key. Experience is key.
Daniel.
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, just going back to how to assess a trial, I think there is a question about that. And I often say to people, don't worry about the statistics. Don't worry about sample size calculation. Stick with the basics. Look to see if there is a registered protocol. Look to see if randomization was properly done, if it's truly blinded. Or is it a trial that only randomized on Mondays and Tuesdays because the doctors who are there on Mondays and Tuesdays are more interested in doing the research, which is not really a randomized trial. So look at this basic stuff first and look for obvious flaws before you go to the complex statistics. Don't worry about the complex statistics. And if you want to develop a trial yourself, yes, what John said is true. Your idea is only good until you do a PubMed search. But in reality, a lot of these other things you'll find in PubMed were either not well conducted or will not answer all the questions that are there to answer about the topic. So you can always do that. And don't go to AI. Call your clever friends who can help you with study design. So if I want to do a new study, I call Leona, I call Fabrizio, I call Professor Nicolaides, John, Mar, Long, and I'll get their opinion about what I'm doing wrong and what I'm doing right.
Leona.
Just want to quickly supplement. I think I completely agree. Going back to basic, actually, what I find is that a lot of young trainees just want to do research without having done the search, without having read the papers. And I think I'm afraid you have to do the hard work. You have to read the papers, because only through that you will learn the right methodology. And I can't tell you whether this is a badly done trial, but certainly a good randomized trial would come with a published protocol, because that has to be transparent, and that there's a clear primary objective, primary outcome, because only with that clear primary outcome, then the project can be built, and then sample size can be calculated appropriately, etc., etc. So I think going back to basic is extremely important. And I'm so grateful to all the speakers today. And actually, I don't know whether it's okay for me to close the webinar, but I just want to let you know what we have planned for you, because and you wonder whether we'll have more and more dry topics, because I'm afraid today's topic is not easy, but it is an extremely important topic. And you can see that we have fantastic faculty list, and including Ben. So don't worry, you'll hear from Ben directly in terms of data quality and picking up fraudulent papers. And our next webinar is on the 30th of April, and we'll start going through study design. I mean, how you can design your study, and we'll cover observational studies as shown, but then followed by the randomized trials, as well as systematic review and meta-analyses, and then we'll go on and talk about statistics. So stay tuned. And yes, we have to start from basic, and there's no other way other than kind of learning how to walk before you can run. And I'm super grateful for all of the speakers here and for you to join us today. And I wonder whether Professor Nicolaides has any final words.
Well, congratulations to all the speakers for their fantastic talk, and the panelists for their great important points they have raised. And congratulations to you, Leona, for creating the Philadelphia Foundation Asia Pacific. You have done well so far. We'll see how we go next time. Nice seeing you all.
Thank you. And see you all next month. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.